Hello, this is Paul Bowman again, and today I am talking to Lindsay Steenberg, who is a senior, I'm going to read this whole bio out, is a senior lecturer in film studies at Oxford Brookes University, where she coordinates the graduate programme in popular cinema. She's published loads of great articles on violence and gender in postmodern and post-feminist media culture. She is the author of the book Forensic Science in Contemporary American Popular Culture, Gender, Crime and Science, and the forthcoming monograph, Are You Not Entertained? Mapping the Gladiator in Visual Culture, for which she was awarded a Research Excellence Fellowship from Oxford Brookes University. She's recently begun a new project funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and in collaboration with Dr. Lisa Coulthard of the University of British Columbia to map the fight sequence in post-millennial action cinema. So if that's not reason enough to be talking to Lindsay for at least an entire day, I can't think of anything else. So hi Lindsay, how are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. All surreal circumstances considering.
Yes, we are still locked down. And yeah, this is a coping mechanism for me completely.
I feel like it's a healthy one. And if there's anything we're going to be doing now, I think watching fight choreography should be right up there.
Yeah. Have you seen the stuff that shared on like YouTube and places where you've got stunt workers, stunt men, stunt women doing the editing together fight scenes?
Oh, I've seen many of those and may have participated in one.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. You'll have to send me the link. But so what shall we talk about? We've met twice at two different conferences. We met at a conference that I held in Cardiff on Bruce Lee.
Yes, indeed.
And you talked about gladiator films, Bruce Lee as a gladiator. And then you held a conference at Oxford Brookes on the pleasures of violence, and at which I believe you talked about gladiators.
I've been known to talk about
So shall we talk about the elephant in the room, which is your love of gladiators?
I do have a love of gladiators. Yes, I find them fascinating, and I find it fascinating sort of from a historical standpoint, and that's why I got a little carried away in my project about gladiators, which wanted to basically map them from ancient Rome to now, which I realized pretty far into the project was very ambitious. So I've been quietly trying to scale back, wanting to write the history of everything. But yes, I find them fascinating, and I find what we sort of do with them even more fascinating. So there's lots of talk with historians and film about how inaccurate some things are, but I find all those moments of inaccuracy absolutely fascinating. So in some ways, I've charted the history that was made up as much as the history that was.
Which is more interesting, the history that can be established factually, or the kind of cinematic history? Or
I find that the cinematic history is just enlightening. So even if we know things are untrue, we know that gladiators never had that famous "we who are about to die salute you." But now, if you saw a gladiator movie that didn't have that, you would feel cheated. You'd be like, no, where did that go? They need to do that. So all those moments that get entrenched but are fabricated, which we know are fabricated, for those I find the most fascinating.
And do you find that the fabrications of gladiators change over time? Like, do they reflect different cultural sensibilities or different ideologies?
They do shift over time. Of course, sort of registering the fantasies or anxieties of any given culture. I looked at the ones from 1910s to the 1950s and, onwards to much more recent fare. But what was maybe even more enlightening was how much they didn't change.
Okay.
So when you sit down to watch a gladiator movie, you can be fairly confident about what you're going to get. There will be small variations, but overall, they're just strikingly similar.
Is that because there is a very well established and venerable Hollywood genre of gladiator movies, or is it something that exceeds Hollywood?
It definitely exceeds Hollywood. It certainly finds a comfortable home in Italian low-budget genre films. The sword and sandals of the 1950s and 60s with bodybuilders like Steve Reeves. They sort of really cement that. But I think it kind of it goes beyond that. I think there is something archetypal, to be honest, about the character type that clings to every story that we tell about him. So, you know, we're telling that story, a Victorian sort of sensational novel will have a similar characteristics even to a 1950s Italian film, which will be very similar even to when that Gladiator character is updated. Like the recent, I guess not so recent now, the 2009 film Gamer with Gerard Butler has a similar kind of structure that other Gladiator films have. So I think it is something about that archetypal nature where we see the character, we identify him, and we know what kind of story he has to tell. You know, what kind of tragic backstory, what kind of thing he brings to a fight. He doesn't want to, but he has to, all of those things.
So what's the oldest or most original instance in film that you know of or that you can think of at the moment of a recognizable gladiator?
Well, I think it kind of, people generally agree that the Sword and Sandal film goes back to films like Cabiria and then adaptations of a Victorian novel called The Last Days of Pompeii.
Okay.
So in The Last Days of Pompeii, we tell the story of many Romans who were destroyed in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And a lot of those have gladiator characters in the background. And the novel itself talks about gladiators. So I think that's probably where that cinematic character is born at the turn of the century and almost at the advent of cinema.
Okay, and I'm gonna go original, I'm gonna go most recent, and I'm gonna go like the most tenuous connection. I mean, is it, so what are the limits? What are the kind of, I know that because you could stretch it and go, you can see textual features, you can see allusions.
Yes.
Where would you draw the line and go, this isn't a gladiator character or a gladiator movie?
And I had to actually be quite strict with myself because I wanted it to be archetypal. And so I was sort of, you know, the fight in Bridget Jones's Diary where Colin Firth and Hugh Grant fight to It's Raining Men. I was looking at that and going, is there something gladiatorial about that? There really isn't too much. That's a fine comedy fight scene, but I think it's that. So I had to be strict with myself and say, there has to be a definition, otherwise that archetype doesn't really, you know, hold water. So I kind of locked down a few characteristics, and they are that he's got to be forced, he or sometimes she has to be forced to fight, and they have to do so in front of a crowd, and normally in an arena space. And that could be a back alley fight club, that could be an amphitheater, even, you know, an MMA cage. It has to have that game space and the audience and the notion of not volunteering to get paid to fight because he thinks it's a good idea, but getting forced to fight through slavery or circumstance. So I kind of locked that down.
I wrote about the very same fight, the fight in Bridget Jones' Diary, in a book about Bruce Lee, because I think there's something significant about that fight in that it's a very well-known instance of a kind of anti-fight choreography.
Yes.
But it's one that, what I argued in the Bruce Lee book was that most action fights are so kind of perfect because they're between two trained experts. But when you when you see a fight like in Bridget Jones' Diary, two completely non-trained people, and it contains all of the things that are censored from a Hollywood fight. So like they don't know their distances, they don't know their ranges, they don't know what technique, they don't have any techniques. Nope. And it's stumbling and apologizing and it's kind of, they basically took everything that isn't in a Hollywood fight scene that could be in a real fight, and kind of made a fight out of it. I think it's a brilliant fight.
I think it's quite delightful. And the fact that they've kind of laid over the It's Raining Men and kind of have, especially women watching it, adds this kind of like the way that you have sometimes two women fighting and it becomes this cat fight version of eroticism, to add the awkward fight choreography of two sort of gentlemen involved in sort of fisticuffs for a female audience, I think is quite hilarious.
And you argued that Bruce Lee's fight with Chuck Norris in the Colosseum at Rome, I mean, it's in the Colosseum at Rome, but
the Colosseum.
I mean, what are the main, apart from the Colosseum, what are the main connections between that particular fight in Way of the Dragon and the gladiator trope?
Well, I mean, I think what, it asks to be read as a gladiator kind of scenario. And I think certainly when it came out, we were just at the dying tail end of the low budget Italian peplum films. So there's a bit of that ghost of that genre thread through it. But the fact that these two guys are fighting as representing different kind of national traditions as well means that, here is the best warrior from this culture who now must face the best warrior from this, in a way that's reminiscent of gladiatorial typing. So there's different armatures in gladiator fighting. They're always paired in significant ways to make a very interesting fight. So I think an audience would go to that and read, okay, Japanese American karate versus, what they call Chinese boxing in the film. Let's see how this works. So I think there's something about that scenario that we are supposed to read, this game-like, this very ludic aspect to it as well. So the setting, the way those warriors are embodied, the way that the fight is as much narrative exposition as spectacle as well. I think that for me all tied up into a very nice gladiatorial moment.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I've been distracted by your reference to Chinese boxing, because I think Way of the Dragon is quite possibly the first film where the term martial arts is used.
Mm-hmm.
And every day I practice martial arts. Yeah, and that very famous scene. Let's not talk too much about etymologies and things like that. But yes, we could with reference to Gladiators, I suppose. I mean, what are the artistic and cultural antecedents of the Hollywood? I mean, of the Hollywood image. So where does Hollywood first get its material from? Is it? Do you think there's one definable source for early Hollywood, or?
For early Hollywood sources, I mean, a lot of them kind of rely on the Italian tradition of this epic adaptation of biblical material. So Quo Vadis becomes adapted many times. The Last Days of Pompeii that I mentioned. So I don't know if there's, other than maybe Cabiria, which people recognize as the source text of the Sword and Sandal film. For Hollywood's Gladiators, what's I think most interesting to me is that gladiator movie becomes a genre. I think we owe that to the Italian peplums, but it becomes a genre that doesn't necessarily need any gladiators in it. It becomes a kind of shorthand that talks about a certain mythic past and a certain kind of masculinity as well. I think it also is associated with a certain kind of reading. And that later becomes a kind of joke, like a gladiator movie, everyone is winking and going, there's naked men there. We all know why you're watching these movies. So I don't think there's a specific text for the Hollywood ones, but they are much more serious than their Italian neighbors. And they tend to be more focused biblically. So in Spartacus, you get sort of Christian allegories. In Barabbas, you get a pretty standard kind of biblical epic that's teaching sort of Christian virtue, and the gladiator is the ultimate opposite of Christian forms of masculinity. So sometimes you get characters like Barabbas and another character in a version of Last Days of Pompeii who are forced to be gladiators and have a spiritual awakening, so they throw off gladiating and realize that it's been wrong all along. So I think the Hollywood epic is sort of so tied to that biblical epic that its gladiators are very different from the joyful Italian ones who often enjoy their work, even if they're forced to do it.
Okay, and then in what kind of is this a character that can go across all genres? So you could have it in sci-fi, you can have it in maybe in horror, you can have it in action.
Absolutely.
Is it something that you can slot the characters and the dramatic situations?
Yeah,
into.
You can. I mean, archetypally it works across genre, but then it tends to take the scenario with it. Science fiction and post-apocalyptic fiction is very, very friendly place for gladiators. I think we have a sense that actually the gladiator is a signal of a society in decline, and he is also sort of the only thing that can survive that society. So you get someone like Mad Max,
Yeah, I was thinking.
you get Katniss Everdeen in Hunger Games. The fact that they have to fight in that way means that they're part of this society that has become corrupt and crumbled. But the fact that they can fight that way means that they're uniquely able to keep surviving, which is a kind of maybe a paradoxical place to be. But you get gladiators in, well, I learned, a fairly thriving romantic fiction subgenre that involves gladiators, alien gladiators, as well as ancient Roman ones. They do well across genres. Tends to be the action genre.
Yeah.
But even in the odd historical epic, you'll get someone who used to be a gladiator, and that sort of is a way of explaining why they're so traumatized.
Okay. And I mean, I want to move on to the wonderful kind of visual presentation that you prepared last night, but is it something that you could map into non-European, non-kind of Euro-American genres? I mean, do you see this in Japanese cinema, Korean cinema? Do you see it in Hong Kong, Chinese cinema?
I think you do, and that scenario, because of its kind of archetypal nature, it does really well. The tournament structure of so many films, mm-hmm. I mean that there's something very gladiatorial, and often when we have these tournaments, people compete not because they're sort of, it seemed like a good career advancing move to go in this tournament. They participate in the tournaments for family honor. Sometimes because they're forced to protect family members. So it does lend itself to a variety of martial arts scenarios. I didn't get the chance to kind of go into the threads of influence across different national traditions, but it's certainly there. I mean, it's certainly there in Japanese historical films. It's certainly there in those tournaments that you'll see in a Hong Kong action film. And many adaptations. So I think it is quite fluid. Okay.
So we have to spend some time with the PowerPoint that you sent to me. So you can see that screen. I've shared the screen.
Yeah.
Gladiators by Dr. Lindsay Steenberg. Let's see if I can click through. So this is the cover of your book, yeah? Are you not entertained?
Yeah, that's the cover of my book.
Let's see if that will. No, that's not working. Oh, there. If I just click. So this is full of. We've got charts. We've got graphs. Can you tell me what we're looking at now? Describe.
I did get very excited by charts and graphs. What I did in the heart of my book, the middle of it, and probably the kind of the sole moment of this book, is that I did a very, very detailed arena sequence analysis. So I took those moments where the gladiators are fighting in the arena and really, really looked at it closely, because it's one thing to map the gladiators, this kind of character, but I really wanted to spend time on the practice of gladiating. So the main spectacle that these films offered. So of the approximately 400 films, television programs, and video games that I had as a central kind of data set of my project, I focused on 30 different time periods, different genres, from Hollywood to post-apocalyptic to direct-to-video modes. And I just looked at how their arena sequences went. So of those 30, I have the average death count. So I spent a lot of time doing kill counts, mm-hmm. which should have led me to a flourishing YouTube career. But I decided to channel this into chart form. And this is the average humans, animals, and aliens who died across different cycles of gladiator films. So you'll notice that around the year 2000 with Gladiator, a bunch of films came out with gladiators in them, and those films were very, very deadly for any gladiators. Those were the films that tended to have huge arena fight sequences where groups fought one another and many, many people died. Whereas the direct-to-video market tended to have your hero who fights much more often than Russell Crowe, but tends to not kill as many people. So this is what I designed here.
Okay. I mean, the first thing that I thought was I was thinking, okay, aliens and gladiators. And then The Life of Brian leapt to mind, because the Life of Brian has both gladiators and aliens, but there's no real direct connection.
It does. And it's part, it has some good arena sequences there. The alien ones that I had were John Carter, the second of the Star Wars prequels, Thor, Ragnarok. So there's a few alien gladiators out there.
So what's the next? What this is average screen time of arena. So this is screen time. How long? Okay.
How long are you spending here?
Oh.
So I just
talk us through this then. Tell us about this.
This is the kind of chart I put up when I'm teaching that my students just kind of shake their heads. They're like,
you see, I wouldn't do very, very well on your module. I mean, like,
the chart.
You know, graphs are one stage away from numbers, and numbers are like some kind of kryptonite to me. They're just like, they kill me. But
I've made friends with them because there were so many texts. There's just so many. There's so many movies about gladiators. There's so many video games. There's commercials. The Women of America's Next Top Model dress as gladiators. The hairy bikers dressed as gladiators on television last night. They're evereverywhere.
Okay, so which is the most significant? Is it the Hunger Games is looking quite significant in terms of fight sequence to runtime.
So what I've done here, I've charted the length of the movie and just said, well, how long of this gladiator movie is spent in an arena sequence? And the Hunger Games, if you recall the movie, the premise is that the teenagers have to go to this game space and they have to fight. So that first movie spends a lot of time in that game space.
Yeah.
Even if once they're in that game space, they're actually not fighting any more often than
have you done the same kind of analysis for training montages? Gladiator?
I haven't yet.
Because, I mean, you know, you need a good montage in a good action film. Well, not all action films, but ideally you've got a training montage.
It's one of the prime pleasures of the genre.
It is.
Gladiators,
that's the next book, right? What? You didn't
Gladiators don't tend to get a training sequence. They already know.
Okay, all right. And then we've got some pie charts.
We do.
Tell us about them.
We do. Why wouldn't we? Well, so once I'm looking at all these numbers and I see how long people spend in the arena, I wanted to figure out, once we're there, we're in the amphitheater, how much of that sequence, that little short film that can stand alone almost, as a short film, how much was spent actually fighting? So, of course, I made friends with the numbers and I just sort of tried to figure out how long they were spending. Now, a lot of this is interpretive, so I tended to measure from the first moment where they kind of say fight and you have the very first clash, whether that's sword on shield or punch to face, that's the fight starting, and I just counted those minutes that were spent actually in combat. So then I could see how that changes. So the post-apocalyptic film spends a lot of time in a game space, but not actually that much time fighting. Mm-hmm. Whereas, in other spaces like the post-millennial or the millennial reboot with Gladiator spends a lot more time actually fighting.
So if you want actual fights, you need to go to the Hollywood Epic and you're going to get some good long fights.
You're going to get some good long, normally group fights as well. But if you really, really want to spend time watching two people actually fighting, direct to video tends to be where you want to be.
Okay.
And I looked mostly at the 90s and early 2000s with the direct to video or straight television film. So these spent a lot of time fighting. And then the post up in the top right hand side, the films that take the gladiator to different places, like video games, like Gamer or Arena, they spent a lot of time fighting.
Okay, that's right. So we've got so direct video, so that's the one. Yes, I'm seeing that now. So anyone who's just listening to the podcast, you're going to need to look at the YouTube iteration of this.
See some pie charts.
What's next? The arena sequences in the film Gladiator.
Yes.
Okay, talk us through this zigzag then. This is looking like a lot of fun.
Basically, I took if the arena fight sequence was the heart of my study of gladiators, the movie Gladiator is a kind of central moment. It did change a lot. It used a lot of similar archetypal patterns, but it really brought this character to the public attention again, and it also sort of added a level of trauma to the backstory of the character we hadn't seen before. Mm-hmm. So I looked at these fight sequences, and I did the thing that I've done before where I wanted to figure out how much of the movie was spent in an arena. And then I wanted to kind of chart how many people died in each sequence. Because you can see a really similar sort of structural thing. Lots of people tend to die in the huge group battles. For example, when Maximus goes to the Colosseum for the first time. And then things lead up to that final showdown where really the only important person that dies is the villain and perhaps the hero. So I just sort of wanted to see how long these sequences were and see if that was true across other films. You know, do we always have one teaser fight right at the beginning where lots of people die, and then we have a sort of, I will show that I'm merciful fight. We'll have a kind of villain versus hero fight. You know, how do they work exactly together, and how can they kind of function almost like video game levels? So ever more and differentiated adversaries before you get to the final sort of level.
Okay.
Those were my numbers there.
Okay. Fabulous. Now, is this, okay, what's this one then? What are we looking at?
And this is the similar thing of just looking within Gladiator as an example. If it, out of all those arena sequences that it had in the last slide, how much was spent fighting and how much was spent, you know, gazing mournfully, unmasking and swearing vengeance? What was the kind of ratio there, I guess? So 79% of all the fight sequences was spent not fighting. Only 21% of all of those gladiator fight sequences were spent actually fighting. So that's maybe somewhat less than you would think. And it meant that really, if you watch these fight sequences, there's a lot going on that isn't fighting. There's a lot of character development. There's a lot of moments where we're asked to sit back and watch the spectacle of hyper-real history. Like just sit back, look at the Colosseum, look at the special effects, look at the costumes, a lot of high angle shots to let you do that, a lot of long takes. So it just sort of meant that this sequence is important for more than just fighting.
What's this?
This I just kind of included for reference. And these are the kinds of films and television programs that I looked at across the Gladiator project. So I guess what I did that might have been a bit different from other studies of gladiators is that I looked at the Roman gladiator, like Spartacus, like the many versions of Pompeii, but then I wanted to look at updates of that character. So I looked at gladiators that take place, or, you know, that are adapted to present day situations. So things like Female Fight Club, which is a direct to video kind of film, and then also things like Fight Club, the David Fincher film. And then I wanted to look at how they're projected into the future. So with things like the Hunger Games that I mentioned, but also Italian post-apocalyptic movies like The New Gladiators as well. So I just sort of, what I wanted to do is to put these characters together in order to draw patterns that were bigger than just films about historical moments.
Okay.
And to see the archetype across those.
Okay. And let's see what else you've got before I ask some more. Ooh.
I think that's, I include that.
Describe this.
This somewhat strange bubble diagram that looks a little like a mind map. This is just an example of some of the genres or subgenres or different labels that are sometimes used to describe movies that have gladiators in them. So I argue that gladiator movies, they're not even really a genre. They're sort of more fluid than that. So I'm borrowing the term filone from Italian genre criticism to kind of imply something much less precise in terms of where it's located, but more precise in terms of the way that we can talk about it. So you'll find gladiator characters and gladiator scenarios across all these different things. Sword and sandal movies, male melodramas, post-apocalyptic films, boxing films even, they all have these scenarios in them. So I just wanted to show how tangled, how networked the gladiator character is. Okay.
So, so you are also a martial artist.
Makes me sound better than I am, but I'll take it.
And yeah, let's call you a martial artist. And I believe you do Jeet Kune Do.
I do, yep.
And because I believe that after last conference we met that, and we'd had a couple of glasses of wine, and this came to light, that there was nothing else for it other than to square off.
I mean, truly, that's how all conferences end, with just a little recreation of Chuck Norris versus Bruce Lee.
All conferences should mandatorily have people facing each other in not precarious glass holding combat, but without spilling a drop.
Just makes it more of a challenge.
So I'm guessing, but I mentioned that mainly because I think that being a martial artist practitioner and a film studies person makes you a connoisseur in a different kind of way of fight choreography, because it's not just about fighting, is it? It's not just about someone swinging a sword around or throwing a punch. It's very much about the way that is shown and the way that different styles of movement interact with each other. I mean, as a kind of martial arts connoisseur as well, are there notable kind of genres of choreography or changes over time, or is it like driven by the fight choreography, or driven by the requirements of mainstream successful choreography, or what do we see here?
But again, because it is such a giant category, and looking, sort of playing spot the move can be a fun sort of pastime. But in terms of large patterns, gladiator films tend to integrate fight choreography that is of the moment. So in something like Barabbas, in Spartacus, you'll note the fight choreography is a bit slow. It's about character, you'll see that there's not actually that much fighting. It tends to be more posing or sort of exposition. And then when they do fight, it doesn't move very quickly. Mm-hmm. And it tends to be shot from very far away often. So if you get Demetrius in the Gladiators with Victor Mature, and he's sort of wrestling a tiger, you're way back in the back of the stand, so you can't see very much. And then up to the more recent ones, where if you look at the TV show Spartacus, you get quite innovative martial arts choreography and very impressive stunt performers who are using things like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. They're throwing in a lot of recognizable MMA moves as well. Yeah. So there does tend to be a dramatic shift in what that is. So somewhere, I think I've argued around the time of Bruce Lee, the gladiator learns a bit of Asian martial arts, and it starts to find its way into the archetype in a way that it hadn't been before the 70s. So when it comes to watching how the gladiator fights, at first you get somebody who's a slave who's thrown into it, who it's the strength of his virtue and character that allows him to fight very well. Whereas, Spartacus in the TV series is very adept at fighting, and so are everybody else around him. They're martial artists, they're professionals, and you can read that in every fight.
Okay. I mean, this is, although I'm going to ask a question about Gladiator, it's not really a gladiatorial type question. So Gladiator came out shortly after, within a couple of years of Braveheart, and both of those films had big battle scenes where two armies charge each other and then go smash into each other. And I remember watching Braveheart, which I think came out sooner, it came out earlier. And the battle scenes were very precise, almost in that kind of what David Bordwell says about like Hong Kong action cinema. It's, you see people getting killed, you see all the techniques, but by the time Gladiator comes out, we go back to a blurry camera, like I'm in the scene and I don't know what the shit's going on, and there's dust and it looks horrific, but you don't see the detail. And it was almost like a new innovation in in camera work and editing that took place, and I thought it was a regression away from I came out of Gladiator the first time I watched it and I was like, I didn't like that film. I couldn't see the fighting, and there wasn't enough of it.
Well, the pie charts don't lie, there was not enough of it. But yeah, that kind of handheld camera. And so Braveheart comes out in the 90s, but then also you get things like Saving Private Ryan. Yeah. So I think that in terms of the special effects that we see in Gladiator, that early moment of using special effects in that way means that they were trying to create that disorienting, subjective, hyper-real kind of camera movement that meant that you didn't get the time to see the moves. It was, just noises in the back and movements in the periphery and a jumble of images rather than a specific moment of two people fighting. So I think in the Colosseum fight, especially when you get chariots and archers and everything on top of one another, that it is designed like Saving Private Ryan for the maximum subjective disorienting experience, which means you don't see the choreography.
Yeah, I mean, that's the fast editing and the moving camera got to such a stage that I think by the time of like The Bourne Identity and then films like Taken, I would far prefer to watch the making of documentary about the fight scenes than the fight scenes themselves.
The fight scenes. Yeah, I distinctly remember, I'm like, they've spent so much time and care on this actual fighting, and I didn't get to see it, and now I feel like I've got handheld camera sickness.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at the choreography that goes into some of the stuff in The Bourne Identity or Taken, it's like, but you've got world class, and you've trained your actors up to such a high level.
And they like to press that fact as well. You know, these guys are training as well. This stuff, this is real.
Yeah.
And you miss it. I think I like a bit of handheld camera. I'm okay with it.
Yeah.
But it only when it comes to the point where I feel, nauseous, but also that they've just kind of embraced that disorientation to such an amount that it feels excessive. That's the moment where, one of the Bourne films especially, I thought, come on, we can just dial it down.
If you go back to the Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris fight scene in Way of the Dragon or Return of the Dragon, depending on which continent you're on. He mixes up the cinematography and the choreography mixes up a lot of different techniques, doesn't it? But all of it emphasizes being able to see what is going on, even if it's fast.
Characters see it as well, so the audience sees it carefully, but the characters they develop based on it. Yeah. So I think that for me as well is quite noteworthy of that fight sequence. You see the development in it.
Oh God, yeah, it's got the best. I mean, it's got the best lesson in fighting, and it's so Bruce Lee's fighting in quite a rigid way of 1, 2, 3. But Chuck Norris's or Colt is better at that. He's bigger and he's stronger and he's a karateka, so he's like bang, bang, bang. And then Bruce Lee kind of goes, oh, hang on, I remember watching Muhammad Ali fight. And he just switches.
Yeah.
And you can see that he's trying to move like Muhammad Ali. And he starts to win. So then Chuck Norris tries to do that, but he hasn't trained that way and he can't do it.
It's when Chuck Norris starts mimicking it as well, and you see all the kind of trying to copy one another as well. I mean, what is so interesting, I think, when it comes to being a teacher for these fight sequences is when I'm talking to students who have filmmaking on their mind, I just really want to emphasize that, have amazing fighters and stunt performers, but don't ever forget how important those fight sequences are to character development, to the plot of your movie, and how much you can make them work for you in that kind of way.
Yeah.
And there we have Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris, and it's sort of telling the whole movie through that fight scene.
But the other one that always leaps to mind is from the Grandmaster, where you have Ip Man in his first fight with Gong right? So and they fight, and if you don't know what you're looking at, so Ip Man is Wing Chun or Yong Chun, depending on where you are, and Gong is a kind of Bagua style of fighting, and they both fight each other, and they're both learning, and then halfway through, Ip Man just changes his stance to that's a complete Bagua posture, and she notices and goes out. So she changes to his Wing Chun posture, and it's like a love story. They're both, and there's this communication. But if you don't know, if you're not a martial art nerd, you don't like, oh my God, he's just completely changed to her style, just to show like, I know what you're doing and I can understand it and I can speak that language. And she goes, well, I guess what I've learned from you.
I guess I can speak that language as well. I think when you're watching it without the sort of martial arts nerd backstory, there's still a place for where the way that the performers are expressing themselves. If you can't spot the stances, if you don't know what those moves, how they fit into context. You can see it because the performers in that sequence, I thought they did beautifully when it came to expressing through their faces as well what they were doing. So, you know, the look of sort of curiosity or slight confusion was so in keeping with what they were doing with their martial arts that I think, you know, even without knowing the stances, there's something to read in those performances that's quite astonishing as well.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess what we should talk, we're like, what's next for Lindsay Steenberg? What's the next? Tell us more about the ongoing and future stuff that you're working on, and where's it going to appear and what's happening?
Well, sort of just recently I began a project with a colleague, Lisa Coulthard at the University of British Columbia, where we, again, I've probably been overambitious, but we have aimed to map the fight sequence as a kind of distinct, a discrete unit of cinema. So we just want to look at fight scenes. And we've decided that we had to call a time period, otherwise we could be looking at fight scenes for our lives, which is not a bad thing. So we're going to just look at post-millennial fight scenes in Hollywood. And we're going to attempt to, again, embrace the pie chart and do something very specific in mapping these fight scenes. What do they sound like? How are they staged? We really want to map them in a very precise way and build a kind of giant magical database of fighting that we will leave for posterity's sake, for the benefit of humankind, all the fighting. And we're really just interested in taking that sequence out and looking at it on its own terms and how it is structured, how it works together, how the performers work, like I said, the sound, video game logic, the moves themselves. So that's what we've started. We'll be doing a virtual conference at the end of May, and I'll see how that goes.
Virtual, on that subject? On
that subject. We're going to look at the sound and music in particular for the John Wick franchise.
Oh, okay. And that sounds like the best project ever.
It might be. I'm not gonna lie, I'm very excited about it.
Yeah. No, that sounds absolutely magnificent. And how long have you set yourselves to do this, or to do some of it, or?
To start, I mean, I feel like it's just a start to something bigger. I think the project gave us 2 or 3 years. Now that's been paused somewhat,
yeah,
because we had planned, I mean, we were supposed to do a few research trips that we're not going to be able to do. So luckily, I think that there's an extension with the grant so that we can push things back a year. So the next 2 or 3 years we'll be looking at fighting. And then we hope to kind of broaden out the scope of the project. We're really interested in designing methodologies right now. How do you look at a fight? You know, pie charts, they're one option, but there are many others.
I would urge you to explore others.
Yes, I will be exploring others. I will. You know, we really want to spend some time with stunt performers, martial artists, stunt choreographers. So we want to do a kind of like look towards production studies as well, but you know, also looking at sound and how important that is to fight sequences, because often they are the violence. Like people aren't really hitting each other. We just hear them hit each other. So, you know, that's the stuff that we're quite interested in developing. How do you analyze that?
Well, I'm so delighted that you're doing this, because it's something that I've always had a vague understanding that it desperately needed to be done. And I thought that it might be me that needed to do it. But I kind of knew that it was beyond my ability, because it would probably involve numbers and time sequences and doing a large scale kind of comparative analysis of different, and I'm just not organized enough to do that. But I think that this honestly is the best project that I've heard about, possibly ever.
It is pretty exciting, and I enjoy the moment explaining what I'm doing to people either in my university or at a conference, or sort of just friends, telling them what I'm doing, and just the look of, wow,
that's the best thing
I'm like,
ever.
Oh, I can. Oh, I will. Just wait for it.
Okay. Well, on that note, I would like to say thank you ever so much for telling me about these things.
My pleasure.
you have to keep me posted, and yeah, and don't let any of this appear in the world without telling me about it first.
We will keep you up to date on our fight status.
All right, thank you, Lindsay.